So we've talked extensively now about how the kidneys produce urine. By combining the processes of glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion, urine is formed as they pass through the nephron of the kidneys. Urine will flow through the collecting duct into the papillary ducts and out the renal papillae into the minor calyx, major calyx, and renal pelvis until it hits the ureter and eventually ends up in the urinary bladder until it is ready to be released. We are going to hit on the remaining components of the urinary system and also go over a few of the concepts related to urinalysis. Lots can be determined about someone by the contents of their urine. Urine has parameters within which it's considered normal, and if any of those parameters are too high or too low, we can make some deductions about the health of that person. Despite all of the fluid that is filtered through the glomerulus, only about 1 to 2 liters of urine is formed per day. Its color and turbidity will vary based on the concentrations of solutes inside of the urine. And as you likely discussed a bit more in your lab class, urine's pH and specific gravity have their own parameters as well. The pH of urine is right around 6, but it can range between 4.6 and 8. That is a normal range for the pH of urine to exist within. But one thing to keep in mind here is that the pH is normally slightly acidic. So the lining of the urinary bladder and the urethra will need to be able to account for this. We will also see when we get to the reproductive system that semen will be slightly basic, and therefore there needs to be certain secretions in the semen that are going to help to neutralize this pH to protect the sperm cells. Now, specific gravity is another characteristic that, again, I'll expect that you would have gone over in your lab class. But in the event that you didn't, I'm going to go ahead and explain what specific gravity is. The specific gravity of a substance is the density of that substance divided by the density of water. If we consider that the density of water is 1, whenever we take solutes and add them to water, the density is going to go up. So therefore, urine, which has solutes in it, will always be a little bit denser than water. The specific gravity of urine ranges between 1.001 and 1.035. And this is a measure that we can check with the refractometer that again was discussed in the lab class. Your lab class is designed to go over the concepts of urinalysis, so I am just going to give a quick overview of what this process entails and a few of the things that we can assess the urine for. Albumin, glucose, red blood cells, ketone bodies, and microbes are not naturally supposed to be found in the urine. So in the event that they are present, this can give us some indication about the overall health of the patient. Urinalysis uses these pH strips to check the urine for these substances. You can see that this dipstick will contain several squares of different colors, and each one of these squares is going to mark for a different solute that can be found in the urine. Albumin is a very, very large plasma protein, and it generally is too big to get filtered out through glomerular filtration. In the event that albumin is found in the urine, that's going to indicate that there's some type of glomerular damage, and albumin is going where it is not supposed to go. In the event that larger substances are leaking out of the glomerulus through glomerular filtration, we also need to account for the white blood cells and red blood cells that can be found in the blood also. Glucose is another substance that we're not supposed to find in the urine. Glucose is supposed to be 100% reabsorbed. But in the event of diabetes mellitus, glucose cannot be taken up by our cells, and therefore excess glucose in the urine will not fully be able to be reabsorbed. In the event that microbes can be found in the urine, we're typically looking at some type of infection or perhaps a UTI. There are many other things that we can assess the urine for, but these are just some of the more common ones that you guys will likely see in your future careers. So the next component that we're going to discuss is the ureter. The renal pelvis will eventually form the ureter, which will go all the way down to the urinary bladder. 3 mechanisms force urine down the ureter, including hydrostatic pressure as more substances are filtered from the kidneys, peristaltic waves as the ureter will also contract to force urine downwards, and our good old friend, gravity. As the ureters enter into the urinary bladder, there is in fact no valve to prevent backflow from the urinary bladder into the ureter. Instead, filling of the bladder is actually going to compress the opening, and that is how we're going to prevent backflow of urine into the ureter. The last thing that we would want is for urine backflow to prevent filtration in the kidneys. Now, the urinary bladder is a singular muscular hollow organ, and its main role is to serve as a reservoir for urine so that we can control its elimination. This organ is distensible, which means that it's capable of being stretched. And this is going to happen as urine is filling up the urinary bladder. You can see here that about 700 to 800 milliliters of urine can actually fit inside of the urinary bladder. But right around the 200 milliliter mark is when you start feeling like you've got to go. You can see the urinary bladder shown right here, and the two ureters that are leading in to this organ. The ureteral openings can be found here, and you'll find the internal urethral orifice that's found here connecting to the urethra. These three structures make this little triangle, and we call this triangular area the trigone. The urinary bladder is lined by a muscle known as the detrusor muscle. This is going to help to squeeze to force urine out of the urethra. And on the inside of the urine, as this is a distensible organ, we're going to find rugae, just as we saw in the stomach. This organ needs to be able to open up and stretch as more urine is going to be formed all the time and put into the urinary bladder. This organ is considered infraperitoneal, as you'll find the peritoneum found right here. This means that this organ is found under the peritoneum, and it's not technically going to be wrapped up in that serous membrane. Now, around the internal urethral orifice, we're going to find the internal urethral sphincter. We'll also find the external urethral orifice and an external urethral sphincter that can be found right here. The internal and external urethral sphincters work a lot like the internal and external anal sphincters. When fluid starts to push past the internal urethral sphincter, that's going to give one the sensation that urination is necessary. But it is the external urethral sphincter that will allow for the voluntary release of urine, which is known as micturition. The internal urethral sphincter is the involuntary of the two, and the external urethral sphincter is the voluntary of the two. When the urinary bladder and those sphincters are stretched, stretch receptors are going to signal up to the brain that the urinary bladder is filling. When the time and place is right, the voluntary external urethral sphincter can be controlled to allow for micturition and the elimination of urine from the body. The urethra is a very important component of the urinary system to mention, because it is the one component of the urinary system that is actually different between males and females. In males, the urethra is much longer than it is in females, and you can see the urethra coursing right here. The female urethra is much shorter, and it can be found right here. In fact, in males, it is so much longer that there's actually three different parts. We'll first have the prostatic urethra shown here, we'll find the membranous urethra, or the intermediate urethra, found back here, and then we'll find the penile urethra, which can be found housed within the penis. In females, the urethra will sit just anterior to the vagina, and in males, the urethra will be shared between the urinary system as well as the reproductive system. As we close out of the urinary system, I do want to mention a few clinical connections that will be related to this system. Dialysis is a procedure where the blood is removed from the body and cleaned in the event that the kidneys are not working. You can see here that blood will be taken out of the body, cleaned, and eventually put back in the body. As I mentioned, this procedure is prescribed for individuals whose kidneys are not properly functional. We'll also have incontinence, which just refers to urinary retention, and I'm also going to quickly mention diuretics. Now, this is not the first time that I've mentioned diuretics, as I've briefly mentioned these when we were discussing blood pressure. Diuretics are drugs that stimulate diuresis, and so they amp up urine production. These drugs will often be prescribed to help lower blood volume and therefore lower blood pressure. The kidneys can be grouped with many other organs, and all of these together make up the waste management system of our bodies. There are many different types of waste products that are produced in the human body every single day. And many of these waste products need to be excreted in different ways. We've just now seen that nitrogenous waste and excess ions will be removed by the kidneys. But at the same time, a few chapters ago, we saw how the GI tract will get rid of non-digestible material. Sweat is going to help release excess ions as well, and the lungs are going to help us to excrete carbon dioxide. The liver detoxifies bloods and poisons, and the spleen specifically will filter out overworked and overused red blood cells. So in the systems that we've gone over, we can see that there is a very intricate waste management system. Many systems work together to ensure that toxic waste products and bad substances are removed from our bodies altogether. We'll just see on this slide a few pathological conditions that are related to the urinary system, the first of which is renal calculi. These are also known as kidney stones. You or somebody you know has likely had kidney stones before, so you'll likely be familiar with how painful kidney stones can actually be. Urine that is highly concentrated or stagnant can precipitate and solidify into these little crystals. Passing these through the ureters and the urethra is quite an unpleasant experience. Urinary tract infections, also known as UTIs, are much more common in women than they are in men. The reason for this is because of the length of the urethra. The male urethra is about 5 times as long as the female urethra, and therefore bacteria has a much longer distance to travel to make it up to the male urinary bladder. One thing you may have heard before about urinary tract infections is that cranberry juice should alleviate some of the effects of the infection. In fact, your textbook will tell you that cranberry juice prevents the binding of E. coli to the inner lining of the urinary bladder. So we can finally consider that myth busted. Renal failure is when the kidneys stop working altogether. For whatever reason, filtration stops, and if the kidneys start to fail, this can be potentially life-threatening. Polycystic kidney disease is shown right here. Polycystic means many cysts, and so therefore kidneys will have many different cysts found all over them. Cancer of the urinary bladder is very, very serious, and a kidney transplant is going to take us back to the lymphatic and the immune systems. We need to take into account all of the information that we learned about transplants back in those chapters. We'll have to make sure that the MHC proteins are lining up properly, and we'll also have to make sure that these patients go on immunosuppressant therapy to prevent the rejection of the graft. Lastly, I'll just quickly define a cytoscopy. This is where a scope is inserted through the urethra to get a view of the urinary bladder. So as we age, we're going to see that the urinary system is just as affected as the rest of our body systems. The kidneys will lose a lot of mass as we get older. And one unfortunate fact about the kidneys is that we do not replace our nephrons in the event that they are damaged. Once you lose them, they are gone for good. So it's very important that we take care of these very, very vital organs. Generally, as we get older and atherosclerosis starts to take place, less blood tends to make it through the glomerulus, and the glomerular vessels tend to become damaged. With this decrease in blood flow and damaged glomeruli, we end up with a much lower glomerular filtration rate than what we had when we were young. So we've now seen how important the kidneys are for regulating the pH of our body fluids, regulating the volume and distribution of our body fluids, and also how necessary they are to remove nitrogenous waste and excess substances from our blood. As we come to a close here on Chapter 26, we're not going to say goodbye to the urinary system quite yet. Chapter 27 will cover acid-base balance and fluid homeostasis. And we're going to use that chapter to tie together the actions of many different body systems and see how they all work together. That will conclude our presentations on Chapter 26. I will see you all in our next lecture video when we will start covering Chapter 27.